Hey people, welcome to the Run Testers. It's Kieran here. Now, if there's one thing that I know runners can be a bit guilty of, it's being a little bit one-dimensional in their training. We're not always that good at mixing things up and focusing on cross-training, strength training, maybe jumping in the pool, those kinds of things. So in this video, to help you break up that monotony, to mix things up a bit and be a little bit more smart about your training, we enlisted the help of Wattbike's Jamie Pringle. He's the former head scientist at British Athletics and also the former lead physiologist at the English Institute of Sport. So he knows a thing or two about how to train smart. So we caught up with him to get his insights on why jumping off 2 feet and into the saddle might be a big benefit to your overall kind of training. He also set us 3 workouts that you can try at home. I've done them, and in this video we'll talk you through exactly how to do them, what the benefits are, and show you some tips and tricks for how to build them into your training. So it's fair to say that you don't need access to a top sports scientist like Jamie to make the most out of training on the Wattbike. If you dive into the Wattbike Hub, there are literally hundreds of training sessions, challenges and full training plans that can help benefit your overall training. You can also connect to third-party platforms like Zwift to bring a bit more interactivity to your sessions. Though what we will say is Jamie's 3 sessions that he's prescribed for us here are a great place to start. So Jamie, thanks for joining us. And I guess because us runners kind of love running so much, one of the things that we're often guilty of is that we will just do the same thing over and over. We go out and we run. And I guess one of the things that we wanted to talk to you about was how we might be able to mix that up, not only to make our training a little bit more interesting, but also to make it a little bit more productive. So Jamie, what kind of benefits can we get from doing that?
Well, thanks, Kieran. Yeah, I think it's really threefold for me. I think you've got really instead of, in addition to, and almost just because you know you can and you have the opportunity to go and explore and to try new things. But I think that the instead of kind of question really is that, well, this might be an alternative that lets you get off feet conditioning. So rather than pounding the trails, the roads, the concrete and the tarmac, you can get a cardiovascular conditioning off the bike. Remember, the heart and the lungs don't really mind how you stimulate them. It doesn't matter where that's coming from, so long as it's intense enough and sustained and long enough and repeated enough. So that, in addition side of things, that's helpful just to do more in that sense for the endurance athlete at least. The instead of bit might be that you can then, of course, alternate the that stimulus, and we know for something like high intensity interval training, where you can use periods of higher intensity work, and you can be really, really quite specific. And the best thing about the indoor bike is that precision and control that it offers. Yes, you can get that on treadmill and running, but on the bike, you can dial in intensity, the power output, how hard you're pushing the pedals around, and let the bike control that for you. And that's a really, really unique aspect of indoor cycling on the Wattbike, that precision. And that really just that opens up benefits around the control of intensity and effort. I think that's a key thing to exploit when you're on the Wattbike.
And one of those things, I guess, actually is ergo mode, which I've been using in some of the sessions that you've set me, gives you that ability to move up without sort of jumping gears and overdoing the intensity. And I guess in running, it can be quite hard to sort of gauge that if you're sort of starting to shift up through the gears, whereas you're able with ergo mode, you're sort of gently nudging up through that kind of intensity. And that sense of control is very much there when you're on the bike, which might be harder if you're out kind of and you're running around your local area and you're sort of facing hills, or you can't get to a track, or all these kind of things. The bike gives you access to that sort of really, really fine tuning.
Yeah, absolutely, Kieran. And I think the Wattbike is a really good home. It's effectively a home lab. This is what you can do on that bike is exactly what we do in the human exercise physiology lab. You can work your way, like you just described, you work your way through a spectrum of intensities from lower to higher, and you get a really good insight into how your body works. You get a really good insight into that, how you can deliver an effort and deliver it without precision, and how your body will respond to that. And I mentioned before that idea of just because you can. Well, I think really what is really good about that concept is that exploration of that physicality. And I use a phrase, athletic self-awareness. When you're talking with athletes, you're talking with coaches, and you're talking with anybody who's trying a new type of training, that discovery, that exploration and discovery of what it feels like to deliver those efforts, to feel what it's like to recover from those efforts, and then to do it again the next day and the next week, and to build and progress. That's an athletic self-awareness, which I think something like the Wattbike, your home lab in your spare bedroom, in the garage, wherever you've got it, is a really unique and powerful tool for that, I think.
And then speaking about that, kind of finding that balance and making sure that you've got the right kind of training structure overall, one of the things that's interesting we talk about is kind of keeping the whole kind of training program fresh. And I know that you've mentioned to me before that there's a relationship between variety and monotony being something that can lead to overtraining.
Yes, and I think that probably fits also into the in addition and the instead of categories we were talking about. Because if you want to do more, do you do more of the same? Well, no, I'd probably be pushing people, well, nudging people at least towards as much variety as possible in your program. There's so many different ways of achieving the same end goal. And there's so many different types of sessions that will actually give you very similar adaptations. Some of them might cost a bit more, they might be a bit more fatiguing, some of them might not be, and that's part of that exploration. But the more variety you can have, the more likely you're going to get better long-term overall adaptation. Because the counterpoint to that is that monotony, doing the same thing over and again, doing lots of the same thing over again, we know is a real troublesome starting point for overtraining. And not really just overtraining, but just being stale, and not progressing. So variety is absolutely a good thing. If you're going to add in more things, do different things. If you're going to change a few things, do it differently. And again, the indoor bike for the runner could be a really good way of doing that.
And the other thing that I've found is, and this is that changing things up actually, it's a different challenge for me. So I've always run, I've very rarely been on a bike since I was probably a teenager riding an old mountain bike. And certainly not in terms of the sort of training and following some of the programs and the training sessions that are on there and the ones that you've given me. But it's a very different challenge. So my quads started burning on fire quite early. And for me, actually, there was a bit of a mental challenge here as well. So it was sort of building a little bit of mental resilience because I was doing something different that I might not be good at, that I had to work my way into, that I'm learning something new. And I think there's something about sort of overall mental toughness, but I don't know what your thoughts are on whether that's something you found as well.
Yes, I think absolutely that's a good consequence. I don't think it has to be that way by design necessarily, Kieran, because I think if you go into this, there's a thought there that you want an indoor bike. Maybe you actually got reasonably time pressures that you want to fit a session in. And so there might be a thought that you have to do higher intensity training, high intensity interval training. And yes, that's absolutely a really good use of time and a really good use of the bike, but it doesn't have to be like that. Adding up more sustained and steady work is absolutely fine. And high intensity interval training in itself doesn't have to hurt. We can be really clever and specifically use something like the Wattbike and that precision and control of effort and power to allow us to do different types of sessions that might be really, really short blocks of work that don't really incur much pain, but hopefully will incur gain. Pain does not equal gain. The cost of the session does not necessarily translate into adaptation. Now, don't get me wrong, there are opportunities and times where it is appropriate to give it full gas and really bury yourself, but the returns from those sort of sessions are quick to come, but you will also put yourself in a bit of a hole. And I'd be much more nudging people towards doing things that are consistent on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis, and enjoying that exploration on the bike that we've talked about.
It's interesting because that's something, again, that I think a lot of people may be guilty of. You kind of want to feel that you've gone in and achieved something, and part of that, where you look at what did I achieve, is how much you've sweat and how much it's hurt, and how much it's cost you the next day. And that's sometimes you use those as the cues and the signs. But what's really interesting about the 3 sessions that you set me is that all of those sessions I came off feeling very differently. I came off feeling like I'd worked, but I was able to recover quite quickly. And I think that's a good place to sort of jump in and start to talk about some of the sessions that you've set us. So one by one, let's talk through what the homework that you gave me to do on the Wattbike. So Jamie, the first session that you gave me to do was called Pedal Power Microbursts. So can you explain a little bit about what you set me to do?
Yes, a bit of a long-winded title, but really this is a technique session. This is about accumulating time at high intensities, high power outputs and high forces, and in some cases higher cadences as well, to really focus on the technique of pedaling. And most importantly, to accumulate that time above an intensity that normally wouldn't be particularly sustainable for very long. It's worth pointing out that this session, really, the driving force behind this is the thinking that, in the well-trained, well-conditioned athlete, that high intensity interval training doesn't really improve cardiovascular function as much as maybe some people might think. In the beginner any training will work. But in someone who's already well conditioned, like yourself and like a lot of your viewers and listeners, then this high intensity interval work is really a muscle specific thing, getting about conditioning into the muscle in a very specific way, in this case, in a very specific structure, where we're trying to accumulate that time above a certain threshold, where otherwise it would be pretty fatiguing and cost quite a lot if you try to do longer efforts. In short, this session is short bursts of work that really are about pulses of work of good quality, with good quality technique at those higher powers. But because we're doing lots of them, about adding them up, when you finish this session, you should be able to get off the bike and go, actually, I've suddenly done 15, 20 minutes of work at a pace that otherwise would normally be sustainable for sort of 3 to 4 minutes, 1,500 meter running pace if you're a runner.
Yeah, I mean, having done it, I think it was quite deceptive at that. You know, when you first sort of looked at it, it looked like quite a lot of work, but actually there was something really nice about the momentum of chugging through those sort of short bites. And, you know, and when you got off, you didn't feel like you'd paid too much. So with that, is this something that people can do fairly regularly within their training then?
Yes, absolutely. Given it, this is a relatively fatigue-free session, or it should be if you can deliver it correctly, then I think you could do this all year round. I would often be looking at incorporating this kind of work in that transition to maybe higher, if somebody who's a racer, maybe in the transition to sort of race pace work. And that applies both in cycling and running. But I think you could do this all year round. We'll focus on technique, and the quality of the movement pattern is the key thing we're looking for here. And as I say, without the less cost of this sort of session, if you deliver it correctly, means it shouldn't linger too long in the days afterwards. You should be able to do this at least once a week.
And I guess the other thing here, you know, one thing that Wattbike does very well is put up in front of you how well your technique is. It shows you with real-time graphics about, you know, how your pedal and your technique is working for you. And that also, I think, from a running perspective, or coming as a runner into something new, it gave me something else to focus on aside from the work that I was going to be doing, which was actually quite a nice distraction, but also it gave me, psychologically, it gave me something to aim at throughout, as trying to improve those overall scores and give us something to build. So again, there's something to strive for, I think, which is something that I personally as a runner look for when I'm out doing my sessions, and I found that sort of came over on the bike in a different way here.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you could do this as a running session on a treadmill, you know, the jumping on and off either side of the treadmill belt. You might look a little odd in the gym, but it'd be very, very effective. And again, the same principle would apply, you know, focus on the quality of your running pattern. And that might be on the flat, it might be on a gradient. This could be a really good session for accumulating on a treadmill, you know, gradient running, and doing that in a very controlled and very good quality way. But back to the bike, and you said about that, having quite literally a measurement of technique in front of you and the quality of your pedal stroke. And that's a really good focus for this sort of session. And I think you just described it before. It goes reasonably quickly, and by the end of it, you've accumulated quite a lot of time, you know, at those higher intensities.
So on to session number 2 then, and this one you called the 20-second building blocks. Jamie, what exactly was I required to do here, and what was kind of the purpose of that session?
Well, this is a session where if you like, the effort stays the same through the sets. We're doing 3 sets of work, but as the sets progress, then the duration of the recovery period gets less and less. And so the cardiovascular stress, the cardiorespiratory stress gets higher and higher. But it should be a session where you're always in control, where those 3 sets work your way through them. And it's only by the very end of the final set where you're actually giving it really sort of full gas there. And it still, again, should not be fatiguing in a costly way. Again, this is about the quality of the effort, delivering good, high intensity power outputs at good cadences with good quality technique. And that's really the focus of the session. Control, yes, but accumulating time also.
And I think this was one, when I looked at it on paper, I was sort of almost most fearful of, because you sort of see that recovery time vanishing in front of you as the session goes. And when you're doing the first block, you sort of wonder how I'm going to get to the end. And again, it's about that trying to make sure that you go out in the right controlled fashion in the first set is very important to completing that final set. And again, that's something that I found with kind of ergo mode was helpful. I did this session a couple of times actually, and the first time round I was using the gearing rather than ergo mode, and occasionally I would put the gears up too high and I'd find myself suffering for a bit, and I'd overcook a short interval and go back to ergo mode, maybe kind of help me to even that out. And for this, if you were sort of talking about a running equivalency, is there something that we could sort of point at and say this is kind of what you're doing here on the bike, but this is how it would look in the real world for running?
Yes, I think that the pace of the intensity and the pace of the effort would be equivalent to probably somewhere between 3K and 1500-meter running pace. So pretty quick, not flat out, but pretty quick. And remember, you're doing only short bursts of effort, 20-second effort. So you should always just be in control of that. It might be a little more difficult to do this on the track because of the acceleration and deceleration in running. So the bike is a really useful way of achieving it. And that's maybe a bit more specific to cycling here. I think it's worth just pointing out on this, most of the research evidence, research literature that's looked at interval training, and there's lots of it, most of it will be pointing to the same thing, that the accumulation of time at higher intensity is the important bit, not actually necessarily the overall cost of the session. And that's the principle that's sitting behind the design of this one, that actually, so long as we're accumulating that time, we can play around with the recovery period between the efforts. So long as you're accumulating those efforts, the recovery period will determine that cardiorespiratory loading that you're going to experience. And really, that's the principle of the design of this session. By the end of it, you should be just about in control of it, but you're giving that full attention that it deserves.
So that's that session done. What can I say about that session? Well, basically, if you're going to do that session, be careful with the early pacing, as I mentioned. Don't go out too fast. Jamie did warn about that, but you've really got to try and gauge it right, because that last set of the 3, which is 20 seconds on, 10s off, 20 seconds on, 10s off, will be hard to keep consistency. From a perspective of the sort of intensity and heart rate, my heart rate very rarely went above 150 again. So it's another session where this should feel sort of in control. But as a runner, I think there's definitely a point, if you're going to jump on the bike from a sort of standing start, like you haven't really ever used the bike, you're going to have a bit of a learning curve where you're actually feeling the work in your quads more than you are in your heart rate. So that's going to be a learning curve. I feel like I've already improved the sessions that I've done so far with this, using these sessions that Jamie has given me, and I think that'll only get better. But actually, it's a really nice kind of contained session, and it passes really quickly, that one. I thought it was going to be a really sort of long drag, but because you're constantly checking sort of those beats of the intervals, it sort of seems to flow quite nicely. Yeah, I enjoyed that one. I was dreading it a little bit, but actually it's a much more fun session than I thought it was going to be, and it'd be one that I'd be sort of happy to repeat again and build in. I feel good after it. I feel pumped, and I feel like it was a really good workout without now feeling like I've paid too much of a price cost-wise. So the third and final session was the hour record Redline Fartlek, which was actually the one that, again, sort of terrified me most from that title, but it's not as bad as it sounds. Just explain exactly what that one was, Jamie.
Well, this is a bit of a mishmash of running and cycling. I'm sure most runners will be aware of that fartlek idea of playing around with speed. The hour record is a very specific cycling event where you have to ride as far as you can in that hour, and so you against that clock, and the clock always wins. And it's all about finding the threshold, the lactate turn point, as we talk about it, functional threshold power, as it's often used and described in cycling. Or if you're a runner, somewhere about the 10K to half marathon pace, basically that point at which, if you go above, it gets grippy. And what this session is about hovering either side of that point. So it's an incredibly controlled and precise session to really find the edge of that threshold and then back away, and then just push on and then back away. And it's a real building session that you have to be very patient with it, but it should be a really good session for developing that everything from cardiovascular, cardiorespiratory stimulus through to the muscle itself. Incredibly potent type of session, but one that requires a fair amount of discipline and precision to deliver.
Yeah, and I think actually this was the one that I felt if you tried to take this out onto the track or running would be a little bit harder to get that precision, because moving up and down the gears when you're running is far harder than doing it on the bike where you can edge it.
I think you can do this running, Kieran, but I think you probably would need to use slightly longer duration efforts so you get a bit more control of speed. But in cycling, I think with the beauty of the Wattbike is it's a click of a button, and you can just nudge that power up and nudge that power down.
Okay, and then there was one thing I wanted to ask you. You didn't set me a session for this, but it was actually really the trigger for me to sort of come and look at using an indoor bike in my running training. Was the idea that I might be doing a mountain race. I live in London, there's no big mountains here, so we end up having to travel quite a way to get elevation or go and sort of get those hills in our legs. And one thought was actually, could I recreate that kind of session on the Wattbike by sticking it in a high gear and sitting on it for 2 hours and grinding it out like the longest climb of the Lavaredo? But from us sort of talking, you've got a slightly different perspective on something that I should really do in my training, and I can do this on the indoor bike rather than just doing that, that initial idea that I had.
Yes, well, I don't think there's any replacement to getting out there and doing it and running on the hills in terms of the mechanics involved, running up and downhill for that matter. I think that is very, very specific about the running mechanics and delivering that. The good thing about the bike is it allows us to, as we were talking about before, to add more sessions in, to add more stimulus, potentially to be a little bit of a replacement as well for certain things. And of course, you can go and climb on the bike, on the Wattbike, by simulating. The bike will simulate climbs for you, some of the well-known alpine climbs and shorter ones. You can go up Box Hill, of course, and the bike will simulate the gradients and the inertial characteristics of what it feels like to ride up those. Fundamentally, if we think about, although your legs might feel tired when you're running up a hill and you might feel that localized, specific local fatigue, then it's really the heart and lungs, the heart being the most important part of the overall system. It's actually the limiting factor, even though you do feel it in your legs. So anything we could do that will give us cardiovascular condition is going to help your hill climbing, your flat running, your downhill running, the lot. What we're talking about here, about being specific to the hill climbing, is the specific muscle conditioning and the mechanics. And yes, I'd be encouraging people to use the bike to get that specific conditioning, but you also still need to get out and run up the hills.
So Jamie, as runners hopping onto an indoor bike for the first time, or thinking maybe about doing a little bit more serious training on the indoor bike, are there any sort of tips and bits of advice that you would give us so that we can avoid making any silly mistakes?
I think again, we talked about athletic self-awareness and having that exploration. That's the starting point of this. But my kind of word of warning would be, make sure you make your hard things hard and your easy things easy. So bring a degree of polarization to this training stress. It's quite easy. Well, it's a bit of a risk, at least, to kind of creep towards a bit of a muddling middle ground where you're a little bit tired, so you don't push as hard, and so your easy session isn't quite right. So make it, when it's hard, make it hard. When it's easy, make it easy, and get to a feel for what those numbers will look like in terms of power output and how that feels and how that equates to your running pace as well. Where those heart rates might be coming out if you're using a heart rate monitor, and where the power output is coming out.
So here I am in my kitchen, which is where the trusty steed is. This is my Wattbike Atom here. And one of the first things I've got to do before I go and do the other sessions that Jamie has set me, I need to do a functional threshold power test, an FTP test. Now, a lot of cyclists will be familiar with this test. I've never done it before. It's 20 minutes where the aim is to basically make it as hard as possible, but consistent for the whole 20 minutes. So I have to say, as a runner, it's a brand new thing to me. I'm not entirely looking forward to it. It sounds like it's going to hurt. That will then be used, the stats that we get from that, the FTP rating, will be used in some of the other sessions to guide my effort. The great thing about the Wattbike here is that actually some of these tests are already preloaded into the iPad, so you can just open up the system, whack on FTP test, and be on your merry way. So you'll know exactly what's necessary. It gives you a little breakdown and description of what you need to do, what it's going to do, what it's for, and how it's to be used. So anyway, enough talking, let's crack on. So that's the FTP session done, 20 minutes. I found that as a runner coming onto that, it's quite hard just to keep the consistency of power throughout the 20 minutes and knowing what that looks like, gauging effort. I also really noticed that I think my heart rate stays low when the actual burn in the quads from grinding out in even just in a low gear like fourth gear, which is fairly low considering basically the quads start to burn before my heart rate starts to rise to a point where during running I would feel the same. So yeah, it's a very different feeling and it takes a little while to get used to it. I think I'm going to have to do a couple more of those tests in order to ease into it, but this is going to be a bit of a learning curve when I go to do the main sessions as well, because many of them are based on feel and consistency of feel, so consistency of effort and on a bit of a hair trigger. But I'm now armed with all the data I need to go and tackle these new sessions. Wish me luck. Judging by that, I'm going to need it. So there you have it. There are 3 great sessions that runners can do if you have access to an indoor bike. Jump on a Wattbike if you've got one in your gym. Jamie, thank you very much for talking us through those. It's been a real pleasure. And thanks everyone for watching. We've been the Run Testers. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button. If you've got any questions about these sessions at all, hit us up in the comments below and we'll endeavour to answer them. We can always maybe get Jamie on the phone again, and if you've got any more detail that you want, we'll offer that up later on. But thanks very much for watching and we'll hope to see you again soon.